At lunch, my internet girlfriend texted me a picture of what she was eating, fishing for compliments. It was a spicy tuna poke bowl. She wrote, "Babe, look, I actually ate a real lunch. Tell me I'm amazing." I was about to type good girl when I noticed 4 big red letters on the plate. Aether Incorporated. My heart stopped because, well, I work at Aether Incorporated. The realization landed like a dropped server rack, sudden, loud, and capable of destroying everything in its immediate vicinity. I sat in the company cafeteria with my own poke bowl going warm in front of me, scrolling back through months of carefully anonymized conversation and tried to calculate the odds. San Francisco was a city of nearly 1 million people. Aether Incorporated employed maybe 400. The math was not comforting. I'd spent a year building something real with a woman I called Kitten, late-night voice messages, 2 a.m. conversations about our childhoods, arguments about whether Die Hard was a Christmas movie that somehow turned into the most honest thing either of us had ever said to another person. And she was somewhere in this building right now, eating ramen off an Aether-branded tray, waiting for me to tell her she was a good girl. I did not tell her she was a good girl. I told her I was proud of her, and put my phone face down on the table and stared at the ceiling until the fluorescent lights started to blur. The problem with anonymous relationships built on genuine emotional intimacy is that the anonymity is load-bearing. Pull it out and the whole structure shudders. If I asked Kitten what department she was in, she'd ask me back. She'd want to meet. And everything we'd built in the dark, all that careful, unguarded honesty, would have to survive the harsh, specific light of a Tuesday afternoon in an open plan office, with its passive-aggressive, slack threads and its bad coffee and its hierarchy of whose ideas got credited in meetings. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready for that. So I did what any reasonable person does when faced with a problem that requires immediate action. I gathered intelligence first. The mug was my best lead. I'd steered Kitten toward the Heath Ceramics Midnight Glaze tumbler a month earlier, a limited edition hand-thrown piece with a distinctive matte black finish and a particular weight to it that I knew from holding one in the store. I walked the entire floor twice, scanning desks with the focused nonchalance of a man trying very hard to look like he was just stretching his legs. Nothing. Then my boss Harper pulled me into her office about the pitch deck. And there it was, sitting on the corner of her mahogany desk, like a small ceramic indictment. The exact tumbler, the exact glaze, purchased at the exact pop-up where Kitten had told me she'd been with her best friend. I complimented the cup. Harper said Santana Row, barely glancing at it. I walked out of that office with my face arranged into something I hoped read as neutral, and went directly to the men's room, and stood over the sink for 90 seconds, breathing like a man who had just been told a diagnosis. Harper, my boss. The woman the entire floor called the Iron Lady. The woman who had once sent a company-wide email at 6:45 in the morning about the correct way to label files in the shared drive. Harper was Kitten. Harper, who had whispered babe into her phone while I stood in her doorway trying to be invisible. Who had told someone they'd drive safe and signed off with a kiss sound. Harper, who apparently had a very real, very physical boyfriend coming to visit her at the office the following day. I was the side piece. I was the emotional support animal she kept in a digital cage for 2 a.m. on weeknights when the real relationship didn't have enough warmth in it. I went home and stared at my apartment ceiling and ran the numbers on my own humiliation over a year of conversation. Over a year of being the person she talked to when she couldn't sleep, when work was brutal, when she needed someone to help her choose between 2 versions of a thing, because the choosing itself felt overwhelming. I had been her pressure valve, her background comfort, and she had a boyfriend this entire time. I confirmed it the next morning, the only way I could think of without revealing myself. I told Kitten a new Valentino collection had dropped, and guided her toward a distinctive black knit sweater with the logo over the left chest. When I walked into Harper's office the next day and saw her wearing it, the fabric practically radiating its own specific betrayal, something in my chest went very cold and very quiet. I watched through the glass partition an hour later as a tall, good-looking man strolled into her office, like the building had been constructed to accommodate his particular stride. I heard her voice go to Honey. I heard her tell him she'd picked the outfit for tonight, for meeting his parents. She had used me to dress herself for another man's family dinner. I pulled out my phone and typed, "You are absolute trash, we're done," and blocked her before I could talk myself into something more measured. Through the glass, Harper's expression didn't flicker. She walked her boyfriend to the elevator, looking radiant and settled and completely unaware that she had just been broken up with by someone standing 30 feet away pretending to refill a water bottle. The only mercy in the entire situation was the burner account. She had no idea I was Wes Davis, the employee she'd been casually devastating for 12 months. I decided to keep it that way, bury the whole thing under professionalism and direct deposit, and never think about it again. I was a grown man. I had survived worse. I would focus on the work. The work that afternoon was walking Harper's lead investor through the pitch strategy in person. I straightened my tie and walked into the conference room expecting a friendly VC type in a Patagonia vest, and instead found Blair Vanderbilt. She was seated on the couch with a teacup held in slender fingers, wearing a sharp black blazer over a simple camisole, radiating the specific energy of someone who had been told no her entire life and had systematically dismantled every person who'd attempted it. She was objectively one of the most striking people I had ever been in a room with, and she was staring at my neck, specifically at the silver chain my shirt collar hadn't fully hidden. I felt the floor tilt slightly. I had sent Kitten a close-up photo of that chain when I'd bought it, collarbone and all, and Kitten had said, "Babe makes everything look good." But Harper was Kitten, and Harper looked bored, which meant the photo was gone, which meant I was safe, which was what I told myself while buttoning my collar with fingers that were not entirely steady. I delivered the pitch on autopilot, which was the only way I could function at that particular moment. And when Blair said exceptional in a voice like a verdict being handed down, the room seemed to shift on its axis. Harper whooped. Then she made a comment about Blair's recent breakup, the ex-fiancé who'd apparently ended things, and Blair's expression went to absolute zero in the time it takes to blink. She threatened to pull the funding. Harper folded immediately. I excused myself from the room as fast as dignity would allow, which was not fast enough, because I could feel Blair watching me leave with an attention I couldn't categorize, and wasn't sure I wanted to examine. Harper's message arrived at my desk 12 minutes later. Blair had more questions. Would I do dinner? I said no. She offered to double my year-end bonus. I thought about my rent, my student loans, the very specific way the universe had been humiliating me for the past 48 hours, and I said fine. Send the address. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus had no prices and the water came still or sparkling, and the question was asked with an expression that suggested your answer would be remembered. Blair was already there when I arrived, jacket still on, posture that communicated she had never once slouched in her adult life. She did not look like a woman who had recently been left by a fiancé. She looked like a woman who had decided that the concept of being left was factually incorrect and was preparing to file a correction. I sat down across from her, and she looked at me steadily for a moment and said, "You're going to tell me what you actually think about the expansion strategy." Not the version in the deck. The real version, I told her. All of it. The parts that held, the parts that were optimistic to the point of fiction, the assumption buried in slide 11 that only worked if the regulatory timeline didn't shift. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Harper told me you were good." I said Harper is a reliable judge of professional competence. Blair's mouth did the thing it had done in the conference room, the small involuntary twitch toward something warmer. She said, carefully neutral, that Harper had also mentioned I was recently single. I said Harper had mentioned the same about her. We looked at each other across a table with no prices on the menu, and a very particular understanding that we were both people who had been burned recently, and were sitting in a nice restaurant pretending to talk about venture capital. What I did not know, what I would not know for another 3 weeks, was the part that changed everything. I found out on a Thursday evening when Blair and I were having what had become a regular post-work call, the kind that started at 7 and ended at 10 without either of us remarking on it, and she mentioned offhand that she'd had a weird year online, that she'd gotten close to someone she'd never met in person, and that it had ended suddenly, and she still didn't entirely understand why. She said she'd been careful with her privacy the whole time, that she'd never sent a face photo, that she'd talked to this person almost every day for over a year, and then one day she'd gotten a message that said, "You are absolute trash, we're done," and then nothing. I stopped breathing. She said she'd never figured out what she'd done wrong, that it still bothered her, the not knowing. That she hadn't been the person she'd been accused of being, and she couldn't defend herself to someone who'd already vanished. I sat on my couch with my phone against my ear, and the full weight of my spectacular wrongness settling over me like a building deciding to fall. Blair was not Harper. The mug on Harper's desk was not Kitten's mug, it was a gift. Santana Row had played the same pop-up. The limited edition release had been everywhere that weekend. Half of San Francisco's professional women had probably bought that tumbler. And Harper had been on the phone with her actual boyfriend while I constructed an entire narrative out of a ceramic cup and a Valentino sweater. Kitten was Blair. Blair, who was sitting across from me in the restaurant with her careful posture and her pulled funding threat and her one small involuntary smile, who had been nothing but honest with me for a year, who had received the cruelest text of her recent life, and had no idea it came from the man who was now calling her every evening and finding increasingly thin professional reasons to extend the conversation. I said, "Blair?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Okay," so I told her. All of it. From the cafeteria to the mug to the Valentino sweater to the text I'd sent without enough information and far too much certainty. I told her the burner account username. I heard the exact moment she recognized it. A sharp intake of breath, barely audible, the sound of a calculation completing. The silence after that was the longest of my life. Then she said, "You called me absolute trash." I said yes. She said, "You blocked me without asking a single question." I said yes. I said, "I know that's not fixable by explaining it. I know sorry doesn't do the work. But I needed you to know it wasn't what you thought it was, you weren't what I called you, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for 3 weeks. Another silence. Then she said, very quietly, I cried about that text. I told her that was on me completely, and I was going to be sorry about it for a long time. She said she needed to think. I said, of course. She hung up. She called back in 40 minutes. She said, "You were an idiot." I said completely. She said, "You jumped to the worst possible conclusion without asking a single question." I said yes. She said, "I want you to know that if you ever do something like that again, I will actually pull all of my funding from every project you've ever touched." I said that was completely fair. She said, "Also, for the record, I picked that outfit myself. I never needed help getting dressed." And then she said the chain looked good in the photo, for what it's worth. I laughed. She didn't quite, but I could hear the shape of it in her voice, the almost. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. We had dinner again the following Friday, same restaurant, same no-price menus, and this time when she looked at me across the table, it was without the investor's careful neutrality, just Blair, direct and unsentimental, and occasionally devastating, telling me exactly what she thought with the particular confidence of someone who had decided. I was worth the honesty. I thought about Kitten and all the late nights we'd spent being careful with our privacy, protecting ourselves from the vulnerability of being truly seen. And then I looked at Blair, who had been Kitten the whole time, who had been honest with me in the dark for a year, and was now being honest with me in the light, and I thought that some things find you through every wrong door you've tried to close them behind, and the least you can do, when they finally arrive, is stop blocking the number